The moment Griffin opened the cabin door and saw me sitting there next to her husband, he dropped the gift bag. It hit the floor. A bottle of wine rolled out and shattered. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Hi, I'm Rowan. I'm 37, a therapist. And until that weekend, I thought I had a marriage worth saving. But when you find out your husband's business trip is actually a romantic getaway with another woman who's also married, what do? Would you confront them or let them walk into the truth themselves? Tell me, what would you have done? I used to think my family was ordinary. We lived in Denver in a 2-story brick house with a small porch and maple trees in the front yard. Griffin, my husband, was a creative director for an interior design firm. When we first got married, he would hold my hand on walks along Cherry Creek, talking about Italian chairs and natural light. I loved that about him, the way he looked at objects like they had a soul. I'm a therapist. So much of my life revolves around listening and keeping other people's secrets. Maybe that's why I ignored so many signs. Until I became the one who needed to be heard. We have a daughter named Maisie. She's 9, curly-haired, thoughtful. The kind of child who once asked me, "Mom, why do grown-ups look sad when they think no one's watching?" Griffin was a good father. Or rather, he used to be. He showed up to every parent-teacher meeting, knew all of Maisie's friends by name, and once built her a bookshelf with a hidden drawer. I used to believe that a man like that couldn't possibly betray us. But life isn't written in used to. Over the past year, I began to feel him drift. Not in any obvious way, but in small, silent shifts. He started taking his phone into the bathroom, changed his laptop password without telling me, came home later, took weekend business trips without mentioning the name of the conference. Every time I asked, he smiled, placed his hand on my shoulder, and said, "I'm just doing my best for the future, for the 3 of us." I believe that. Until one February evening when I saw a notification flash across his charging phone in the kitchen. "Can't wait to see you at the cabin. Same wine, same bed." My heart didn't pound, it went still. Like a hollow space had just opened inside me. I didn't touch the phone. I just stood there listening to the dishwasher hum in the background, the scent of peppermint rising from a candle I had lit earlier that evening. Griffin was in the shower. Maisie was upstairs listening to an audiobook about polar bears. I washed my hands and walked upstairs like nothing had happened. But something had. 3 days later, he said he'd be in Portland for a conference. I nodded, but something inside me stayed restless. That night after he fell asleep, I went through the trash folder on our old shared laptop. Nothing much. Until I found the photo of the cabin. It was the place I once chose for my pregnancy retreat 5 years ago. A snowy cabin in Aspen. Pinewood, big windows, stone fireplace. The place where I wrote letters to the baby I never got to meet. I knew every creak in that house, every shadow on its floorboards. And now, someone else was there. With the man I once called my husband. I didn't say anything that morning. Griffin packed his overnight bag like he always did. Neat, efficient. He even brought the travel mug I got him for Father's Day, the one that says, "World's Okayest Dad." He kissed my cheek before he left. Said he'd be back Sunday night. I nodded. I smiled. But inside something had already snapped. Not loudly, just a quiet shift. Like when you notice a picture frame is slightly crooked and suddenly you can't unsee it. That afternoon, I picked Maisie up from school. We stopped for her favorite yogurt parfait and then headed home. I sat at the kitchen table while she colored, and I started thinking. If Griffin really was in Portland, it would be easy to verify. I knew his firm's travel calendar, knew which conferences were legitimate and which ones were just convenient excuses. I opened my laptop. The Portland summit he claimed to attend scheduled for next month. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I searched the address of the Aspen cabin, the one from the photo I had found. It was still listed as a rental property, still bookable, still under our name. Except, the booking for this weekend had been confirmed. By Griffin. I felt something sharp rise in my chest. Anger maybe, or clarity, I wasn't surprised. That part was already gone. What I felt was disrespected. The kind of disrespect that runs deeper than lying. It was the knowledge that he had taken her to a place that once held my grief. A place where we lit candles for the baby we lost. And now it was some kind of romantic hideaway. That night I didn't sleep much. I stared at the ceiling and thought about every strange detail over the past 6 months. His sudden interest in early morning runs, the new cologne, how he started showering right after coming home, how he laughed more at his phone than at anything I said. Still, I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I waited for morning, made breakfast like always, packed Maisie's lunch, answered a few client messages, and when the house was quiet again, I opened my browser and searched the name that had been tagged in one of the cabin photos, Sloane Avery. Her LinkedIn came up first. Director of Public Relations at the same firm Griffin worked for. And married. Married to someone named Caleb Avery. I clicked on his profile next. Civil engineer, based in Boulder, clean-cut photo, kind eyes, wedding ring visible. That's when I knew. This wasn't just an affair. This was two people, risking everything. And it was time someone else knew too. I didn't know what I was hoping for when I messaged him. Just that my hands wouldn't stop shaking until I hit send. It was short, careful. Hi Caleb, I know this is unexpected, but I believe your wife Sloane and my husband Griffin may be involved in something they haven't told us about. I'm reaching out because I thought you deserved to know. If you're open to a conversation, I can share what I found. I signed it Rowan Mercer, and I included my number. I wasn't sure he'd reply. Some men don't want to know. They'd rather live with the illusion, keep things quiet, avoid the mess. But Caleb didn't wait long. 2 hours later, I got a text. Can we talk? His voice when he called was steadier than mine had been. Low, measured, but I could hear the restraint. The careful way he asked, "What exactly did you see?" I told him about the message on Griffin's phone, about the Aspen booking, about the photo of the cabin that had once belonged to us and now belonged to this lie. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deny. When I was finished, he cleared his throat and said, "That explains a lot." Then he told me his version. Sloane had started staying late at the office. Too late even for a director. She changed her phone passcode. Her gym bag smelled like cologne he didn't recognize. She laughed at texts and said they were inside jokes with coworkers. He told me he once asked her directly if something was going on. She got angry, said he didn't trust her, slept in the guest room for 3 nights. I let it go, he said after a pause. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I could feel it in his voice, what it's like to second-guess your gut, to gaslight yourself before anyone else even needs to. We agreed to meet the next morning, somewhere neutral, a little diner in Evergreen, halfway between Denver and Boulder, public enough to feel safe, private enough to say what needed to be said. I didn't sleep that night either. I kept imagining Griffin's face if he ever found out. Not from me, but from someone else, from a husband, because that's what Caleb was now. Not just a stranger, not just a name in a browser, but someone who, like me, had been trusting the wrong person in the same house. By the time I parked outside the diner, snow was falling, the kind of quiet snow that makes everything feel softer, even betrayal. He was already there, seated by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, eyes tired but alert. When I sat down across from him, neither of us said hello. We didn't need to. The waitress came by twice before either of us looked at the menu. Caleb ordered a second coffee. I asked for hot water and lemon, though I didn't touch it. My hand stayed in my lap the whole time. He was the first to speak. "I've had that cabin in my calendar before," he said. "Sloane told me she'd been there for a company retreat once, alone, to reset. That was 2 years ago. Now I wonder if that was the first time." I nodded slowly. I didn't have answers, just evidence. I reached into my bag and took out the folder. Nothing dramatic, just a slim stack of printouts, screenshots, emails, one image of Griffin's reservation confirmation from the cabin's rental site. Caleb flipped through them with steady fingers. When he got to the text about the wine, his lips pressed into a tight line. When he saw the calendar invite marked retreat, Aspen, his jaw moved slightly like he was chewing on something bitter. "She always hated snow," he muttered. I said nothing. I didn't want to comfort him. I didn't need to be comforted either. We weren't there for that. After a while, he looked at me and said, "So what now?" It was a good question. I'd spent so long wondering if I was right, I hadn't let myself think about what next. But sitting there across from someone who'd also been lied to, something inside me felt clear. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I'm not going to slash tires or throw wine in anyone's face. I just want them to see what they've done, without yelling, without giving them a way to twist it." Caleb nodded. What if he said slowly, "We went up there first to the cabin." He shrugged. "If they're going to walk into a lie, maybe we should be the ones holding the truth." The idea settled in the air between us. I didn't answer right away. I thought about that cabin, how I hadn't been back since we lost the baby, how the wood floors still creaked in certain places, how the lake behind it froze solid in winter and shimmered like a sheet of glass. I looked at Caleb. "I still have a key," he said. Of course he did. Sloane probably never asked for it back. I picked up my lemon water, took one sip. "All right," I said softly. "Let's go see how honest they are when they think no one's watching." The next morning I stood in my garage with the keys in my hand. Not car keys, cabin keys. I hadn't touched them in years. They were still attached to the little bronze tag Griffin had made back when we first bought the place. The Mercer Retreat engraved in that serif font he liked. I remember thinking it sounded pretentious at the time. Now it just felt hollow. I put the keys in my coat pocket and started packing. Not much. A few essentials. One bag. Caleb said he'd take care of the rest: snacks, blankets, coffee. I offered to drive myself, and he didn't argue. It was a long drive to Aspen. The sky was low and gray, the roads slick in parts, though not enough to slow me down. I barely noticed the music playing in the background. It was just noise. My thoughts were louder. When I reached the cabin, it was early afternoon. The same gravel crunch under the tires, the same bend in the path that curved toward the porch. But everything else felt different. Caleb's car was already there. He was inside, standing by the fireplace, stacking wood. The air smelled like pine and faint smoke. He looked up when I walked in, gave a small nod. No one smiled. "This place feels like it remembers things," he said. I knew what he meant. The last time I'd been in that room, I was cradling a grief so heavy I could barely stand. Griffin had held me through it, said all the right things, promised we'd come back again with a baby in our arms next time. That baby never came. And now here we were, back in the same place, about to sit in silence and wait for the people we loved to walk in and reveal who they really were. We moved around the space without speaking much. I wiped down the long table. Caleb poured wine into 2 glasses, just 2. He left 2 empty ones near the fireplace, on purpose. I adjusted the lamps, made the room warm, but not too warm, not dark enough to hide, just enough to make sure every expression could be seen clearly. We didn't talk about what we'd say. There wasn't a script, just presence, just the plan to let the moment do the work. At some point we sat down. The sun dipped behind the trees, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. That cabin had always held that kind. Not just quiet, but memory. You could hear the creak of the floor even when no one moved. You could feel your breath in the air even when the fire was going strong. I sat there and thought about the last time I'd cried in that room. 5 years ago, wrapped in a thick blanket, legs tucked under me, Griffin beside me. I'd lost the baby 2 days before. We had come here to get away from doctors, from calls, from the dull ache of sympathy. Griffin had lit the same fireplace, cooked eggs I couldn't eat, read me short stories until I fell asleep. I'd loved him then, I really had. And that's what made it worse now, because when someone betrays you, it's not just what they've done, it's what they've undone. Every memory turns on itself. Every gesture you thought was love starts to feel like performance. I looked across the room at Caleb. He wasn't speaking, but I could tell he was going through the same inventory. Every dinner Sloane had been late for. Every lie disguised as laughter. I didn't feel rage. Not that night. What I felt was stillness, a calm so sharp it could cut through anything. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want tears. I just wanted them to walk into that room and see us. To understand without screaming what it means to be seen fully, finally, for who you really are. The sun had gone down completely now. Shadows stretched across the walls. The air inside felt warm, but my fingers were cold. I folded them around the stem of my wine glass. Then I said more to myself than anyone else. This isn't revenge. This is clarity. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. We agreed not to speak when they arrived. There'd be no yelling, no explanations. Just space. Just presence. That was the plan. Caleb had laid a folder on the coffee table. It wasn't thick, but it held enough printed messages, a few screenshots, one travel receipt in Griffin's name. My phone sat beside it, screen dark, the thread of messages still open between him and Sloane. Caleb had printed a few of those too. We arranged the chairs so they faced the door, not dramatically, just directly. The fire still crackled behind us. The wine hadn't been touched. I glanced at the clock. 5:58 p.m. They were due any minute. Caleb leaned back in his seat, but I could tell by the way he tapped his thumb against his leg that he wasn't relaxed. I wasn't either. But I wasn't nervous anymore, just steady, focused. We didn't look at each other. At 6:03, we heard tires on gravel. I didn't move. He didn't either. The crunch of footsteps followed. Then the sound of a key sliding into the lock. Griffin had no idea the reservation had been altered. I'd made sure of that, logged in through his account, changed the booking name to Caleb's. It hadn't raised any alarms. He rarely checked the confirmation details. The door opened. I heard a laugh first. Her voice. Then Griffin's. That deep, smooth tone he used when he thought he was in control. The door shut behind them. Boots on wood. A suitcase rolling. Then silence. I looked up. Sloane froze mid-step, bouquet of white tulips in her hand. Griffin bumped into her, still holding a wine bag, and looked up with a smirk that fell away the instant our eyes met. Neither of them spoke. The gift bag slipped from his fingers. The wine bottle inside rolled across the floor, hitting the edge of the rug with a dull clink, but didn't break. Sloane's hand shook. The flowers slipped from her grasp and scattered across the wood floor. Griffin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Caleb sat up straighter in his chair. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just looked at my husband. He stared back, eyes wide, mouth tight. He took a slow step forward, then stopped. "Rowan," he finally said, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I stayed silent. He turned toward Caleb. "What is this?" Still no answer. Sloane swallowed hard. Her face had gone pale. She turned to Caleb. "This isn't what it looks like. That old phrase. The universal lie." Caleb stood, picked up the folder from the table, and set it gently on the ottoman between us and them. "This," he said, "is exactly what it looks like." Griffin looked at me again, his jaw clenching. "You went through my stuff." I tilted my head slightly. "I looked at what you left in plain sight." His cheeks flushed. "This is insane." I nodded slowly. "You booked this cabin. With her. The same one we came to after we lost the baby." He opened his mouth but then looked down. Like even he couldn't defend that part. I didn't raise my voice. "I just wanted you to see. That I know." Sloane hadn't said a word since "this isn't what it looks like." She was trembling. Her gaze flicked between the folder and Caleb, then to the fireplace, as if looking for a way to disappear. I almost felt sorry for her, but only almost. Caleb didn't look at her at all. We let the silence stretch, let them stew in it, the discomfort, the weight of what they'd done. I didn't want to break down. I wanted acknowledgement. I leaned forward slightly and asked softly. "How long?" Neither of them answered. I asked again. "How long has this been going on?" Griffin rubbed a hand over his face. "It's complicated." I exhaled through my nose. "No, it really isn't." Sloane finally sat down slowly, like her body didn't trust the floor beneath it. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She still hadn't looked at Caleb. Not really. Griffin remained standing, but his posture had changed. Shoulders slumped, defensiveness cracked just slightly. I asked again, "How long?" His eyes met mine for a beat too long. Then he looked away. "Almost a year. That was longer than I expected. But I didn't flinch. I didn't give him that." Sloane's head dipped. Her voice was so soft it barely reached the space between us. 8 months. She and Griffin hadn't even agreed on the timeline. That somehow said more than they realized. Caleb hadn't moved. His arms were crossed now, and he was staring out the window behind them, watching the lake disappear into dusk. He finally spoke. "Was any of it real?" Sloane turned to him then. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. A useless sentence. A coward's sentence." I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. "Did you ever think about telling us?" I asked. Griffin looked at me. "I was going to, when I asked." Before or after this weekend in the cabin, I grieved our child. His face crumpled slightly, like he hadn't expected me to bring that up. But how could I not? That detail wasn't just painful, it was surgical. It proved how easily he compartmentalized things I once thought sacred. He took a breath. "I made a mistake." I tilted my head. "Mistakes are accidents. This was a decision, repeated, planned, reserved." Sloane flinched at that word. Caleb finally turned back toward her. "Who are you?" Sloane blinked. Caleb, I didn't mean. He raised a hand just enough to stop her. I don't want the performance. Not here. She swallowed hard and her voice came out shaky. I didn't come here to hurt you. No, he said. You just didn't care if you did. The air in the room felt tight again. Not from shouting, but from truth. I stood slowly, picked up the folder, set it back in my bag. I didn't come here to make a scene, I said. And I think we're done now. Griffin stepped forward. His voice desperate for the first time. Rowan, wait. Can we talk? Just the two of us? I looked at him, really looked. For the first time in months, I saw his face clearly. Not the curated version I'd been clinging to, but the one I'd been refusing to admit was slipping away. The cracks, the shadows, the part of him that had already left long before I knew it. No, I said. Then I turned to Sloane. I hope this was worth everything you've just lost. She didn't answer. Caleb didn't say anything either. He just opened the door. Cold air swept in, brushing against my skin like a reset, a reminder. As I stepped outside, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. The night had fallen fully now. The trees were black outlines against a navy sky. Snow had begun to fall light, but steady. Caleb walked me to my car. We didn't talk for a while. Then he said, You handled that better than I ever could have. I shook my head. No, just quieter. He smiled almost. Then he said, I'm going to stay here tonight. I don't want her driving. I nodded. I understand. I looked back once just before opening my door. The light from the cabin spilled out like a stage set. 2 people still inside, exposed. But the show was over. I drove home in silence. The snow kept falling soft and constant, as if it had been waiting for something to break before it started. The roads were empty. My phone buzzed twice, once from Griffin, once from an unknown number I guessed was Sloane. I didn't read either. When I reached home, the lights in Maisie's room were still on. My sister had picked her up that morning, taken her out for ice cream and a movie. She waved from the couch when I walked in. Everything okay? She asked gently. I nodded. Yeah, everything's clearer now. That was all I said. It was all I needed to. I didn't cry that night. I folded laundry, put away the groceries someone else had dropped off, stared at the hallway mirror and tried to see what had changed in my face. Something had. I was tired but not broken. The next morning I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote an email to Griffin. Not a fight, not an essay. Just a list. A list of what I knew. A list of what I had already copied and documented. A list of what would happen next: separation, legal steps, a conversation with Maisie handled with care. No anger, just facts. He replied within an hour. Can we please talk in person? I didn't respond. Instead, I called the attorney I had already spoken to 3 months ago, back when things first started to feel off, and I needed to prepare quietly. I scheduled a formal filing for the following week. Griffin tried again 2 days later, left a voicemail, apologizing, begging, saying things like, I was confused and it didn't mean I stopped loving you. But the thing is, love isn't a pass. It's not a shield. It doesn't cancel out choices made behind closed doors. You don't get to light a fire in someone else's house and then say, but I still care about the furniture. Meanwhile, Caleb texted once. Just a simple message. She's gone. I didn't ask where Sloane had gone or how that final conversation ended. I didn't need to know. Some endings are better left untouched. Instead, I wrote back, How are you doing? It took him a while to reply. His answer was one word, lighter. Weeks passed. Griffin tried to push for counseling, for rebuilding. He sent flowers, long emails, promises. I didn't answer any of them. It wasn't that I hated him. I didn't. It was worse than that. I didn't believe him anymore. And once that belief is gone, no bouquet, no paragraph, no grand apology can sew it back into place. I told Maisie that her father and I were going to live in different houses for a while. I didn't say why. Not yet. Just that sometimes grown-ups stop being right for each other in the same house. She asked if he would still come to her soccer games. I said yes, because he would. I moved out first, not out of fear, out of clarity. The apartment I found was small but full of windows. On my second night there, I opened every one, let the cold in, let the weight out. One afternoon, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, from Griffin. He said he missed the sound of my footsteps in the morning, the scent of rosemary I always put in the roast, the way I knew how to say something hard without raising my voice. But nowhere in the letter did he say he made a mistake because of something inside him. It was all about what he lost. That was the final confirmation. He still didn't get it. He wasn't sorry for who he'd become. He was sorry for being caught. Sorry for the consequences. Sorry to be left standing in a room he never thought would empty. I didn't write back. Instead, I went to the bookstore and bought a new journal. The last one I'd kept had stopped months ago, right when I began sensing something was wrong. Like I couldn't write the truth until I saw it clearly. That night, I wrote something on the first page. It wasn't poetic. It just said you weren't wrong to see it. You weren't weak for hoping you weren't right. But you're not going back. You're going forward. 2 months later, I walked into a new therapist's office. I wasn't there to talk about Griffin. I was there to talk about myself. What I let slide. What I stayed silent about. What I'd like to build again, but better. It's funny. I help other people through this kind of grief every day. But healing doesn't happen because you understand it. It happens when you live through it without shortcuts. 6 months later, I stood on the porch of a different cabin, not the one in Aspen. That place was sold a month after the divorce papers were finalized. I didn't want it anymore. Some homes carry too many ghosts, even when they're beautiful. This one was smaller, quieter, tucked deeper in the pines near Telluride. It had no history, just possibility. Maisie was inside reading by the fireplace, her feet tucked under a blanket. She was adjusting in her own way, asking bigger questions, needing softer answers. We were learning how to navigate this new shape of our family, one honest conversation at a time. Griffin still called, still asked if there was a chance, still used the word love like a key to a door he'd already broken down. I no longer felt the need to answer, because clarity, once it arrives, doesn't argue. It just stays. I started seeing clients again, mostly women. Many of them had their own version of what I went through. Some were still in it. Some had stayed longer than they should have. All of them carried the weight of silence. I never told them what to do. I just listened. The way someone once did for me when I wasn't ready to speak yet. Sometimes Caleb texts. Not often. Just little things. A picture of his dog on a trail. A recipe that made him think of something I said. No expectations. Just two people who went through the fire and came out different. The last message he sent was simple. Some truths break things, but they also let light in. I didn't reply right away. I let that one sit for a while. Then I wrote back. Thank you for being willing to stand in the room. Most people run. So if you're listening to this wherever you are, maybe you've been lied to. Maybe you've had to sit across from someone who swore they loved you while hiding an entirely different life. I'm not here to tell you how to feel. I'm just here to say what you do with the truth is yours. And clarity isn't loud. Sometimes it just walks out the door and doesn't look back.